Hi, I'm Gemdust, and in this video I will be showing you how to make an inventory much like the one you are seeing currently within the Godot engine. As you can see, I already did a bit of setup by adding two testing images, which will just be used for testing the items when in the inventory. You can use any sprite for this, these are just the ones I picked out. But the first thing you'll want to do is create a new resource, but that will be in a script since it will be for items. And it will only extend a resource, and let's call it item. This is so that it's simpler to add new items, which I will demonstrate once we get the rest of this done. So first of all, let's add an export for a sprite, which will be a texture. And let's also provide it a maximum stack size, which I will store as an integer. Now that this is done, you will see that if I were to create a new resource, we can navigate to item, and let's call it stone. And we can simply now drag the stone image and provide it with a maximum stack size. And we can do the same for wood by just creating a new resource and dragging the wood and giving it a stack size as well, which I'll have different to show you guys that it works once we get to the inventory. And just for some organization, I will have a few different folders just to keep track of things more simply. As you can see, I already did by having a sprites folder. So we also need a way to load these in, which we can do on the spot by using a load, or how I prefer to do it currently is creating a function that can load it from an ID, which will merely be the file name. So for stone, it would be stone, as you see here, and this will return an item since it returns loading. Now we will need the directory for the file path, so we can include that in a static variable in case we ever decide to change it, or we want it to be accessible elsewhere. And we will make this the directory, and it will also be a string. So we can add the directory and the ID, and we will also need to include the extension. And if we call this, we will now be getting whatever it is that we want. So if we were to call load from ID and we pass it the parameter of stone, we would get the stone material, or if we pass it wood, we would get the wood material. Next up, we will make an item stack, which will not handle any of the visuals, but that is because for an inventory, I would like it to show what the current stack size is. But if it were to, for example, be dropped on the ground, I feel it's preferable not to show, so I prefer separating those two. But if you are planning on just only having it ever show or not show the stack size, you can implement both immediately, but this is just how I prefer to do it. So I will showcase it in this way. So let's again give it a class name, and it too will extend a resource, just so it's easier to store again. And let's provide it with the stack size variable, which will be an int. And let's provide it with the item that it is storing. And now let's provide it with an initiation function. So that is the init. And we'll want to pass it an item and a stack size. Now it's fine to have these parameters be the same as the member variables, so long as you append the members with self. so you would simply be able to write it as such. You can have these something like this, but this, again, how I prefer to do it. And we can make use of getters and setters here, which I will just make a quick skeleton for. To change the functionality when we, for example, do this. So for this, I will do emit changed, which is a built-in function to resource, which you can use whenever something changes, such as the stack size, since again, I want the stack size to be shown in the actual visuals, which will be shown better once we get to the item slot. So let's get started on the item slot. We would just create a node for that and attach to it a script for the item slot. Then let's also just provide it with its own sprite. So that will be the item slot sprite. And just as a placeholder, I will do the general Godot icon. And let's just move it over there. And once we store this, let's move it over to scenes. And just because my placeholder sprites are 16 by 16, and I want some margin between the Godot, the item slots boundary, or border, and the item, I will make it 20 by 20, which I would just need to scale it as such to make it 20 by 20. Next up, we can add a sprite for the actual item. And let's add a label for the stack size, which, just because of the very small skill I'm working on, I will make a theme override to make the font size only 8 pixels, which makes it a lot smaller, but also a lot more fitting to the size. Then let's create the item slot, which again, we'll just make a class name. And let's have it store the item stack, which will by default be null. And again, we'll have a getter and setter. This will make more sense once we add the following, which will be a function to update the render, which won't return anything. And this is so that whenever the item stack is changed, we can modify these two accordingly. So if the item stack is null, we of course want both of these to be hidden. So we can simply hide them if item stack is null. And if it is not null, we can simply show them instead and update their values to something more fitting. So we can change the texture to reflect the item sprite as we defined inside of the material. And we can change the text of stack size to instead be the stack size of the item. Though let's make it the string representation, just so it doesn't dislike it. And now we need to actually connect this changing to the update render. And I forgot to set this to the value. But then we update the render whenever the item stack is changed. So whenever we do something like item stack equals just a pseudocode, let's just say wood of 5. This is just some pseudocode to represent the idea. So whenever we change it to a new value, this would run, set the item stack to the new value, and then run this code, which we can use in conjunction with the emit changed by using the connect, by just doing item stack.connect the changed signal to update render. And now whenever the item stack emits the changed signal, which again is built into the resource type, we will also call update render, which is why these are very useful. They can communicate up more simply. Just a quick few notes before I move on. You will want to actually provide the directory for the item, which you can do by simply copying the path of this into here and making it a string just so that it actually knows where to find the files. And item slot should be a control node, which you can change easily by just changing the type through here and going in the script and changing what it extends from a node to D as it is initially to a control. But now let's see if it in fact works. So we can do that through making a new scene, which will simply be the game scene. So let's just store that. And let's provide it with a game manager script. And then let's provide it an item slot. And let's just have that be roughly in the center, just so it's in a central position. And let's provide it a button. And then let's have that button just say stone. And let's also just rename it to the stone button. And then when it is pressed, we can connect the signal to the game manager script to change the content of item slot. So if the stack inside of item slot is null, we want to give it an entirely new stack, which we can simply do by creating a new item stack, creating an item by loading from an ID, and passing it an ID, which will just be the file name again. So stone, since it is the stone button, and let's give it a stack size of 9. And if it is not null, we can simply instead increase the stack size by, let's say, 12. I already did some changes, like changing the viewport to 640 by 360, changing the stretch mode to viewport, and changing textures from linear to nearest, just to have it look a bit better. And as you can see, when I run it and select game as the main scene, you can see the main view, which I supposedly did not change to stretch viewport, just to make it look a bit more in nature. Though you can have either, as you saw. It doesn't mess with the scaling or anything. And we can just pass it stone, which currently the stack size is not to the right, it instead is left to right. But that can be changed easily enough. And I will show you how to do that once we get further. But for now, you can see that it in fact did work, and it was updating the stack size whether we changed what the item stack was, or if we merely changed the item stack through the stack size. So now we can run the program and make sure it all works as it should. So as you can see, you will have your item slot wherever you placed it. And if you press the stone button, you will see that the text does in fact appear. It starts at 9 and then goes up in increments of 12. Currently there is nothing that dictates how the label should be presented, nor enforcing the max stack size. but we will get to that now. So the most important thing that you'll want to do is go into the stack size label, go into layout, and change the layout mode to anchors, then change anchors preset to custom, and change the grow direction from horizontal to left. So now if the label, which I'll just shrink down for demonstration, becomes too long, it will grow to the left instead of the right, just so that it stays aligned with the right side. And I'll just move it slightly up. And now you have a stack size. And you'll want to change the horizontal alignment to right, preferably, just so that it actually stays to the right, no matter how big you set this to be initially. And you can set the vertical alignment to whatever you feel fits your needs best. So if I were to resize it now, it would stay in the center, or I could have it be at the bottom or the top. It's whatever you feel you need. Next up, let's create a simple inventory, which will be able to hold a lot of item slots, just to make sure you don't need to make a ton of item slots yourself manually. So let's create a control node, and let's add a flow container. And let's change the flow container to have an H and V separation of 20, which is just because that is the size of my item slot sprite, since item slots are what will be placed in here. So as you can see, if I were to add item slots to the inventory as it is right now, which I will just quickly rename, and I were to add an item slot and another item slot, you can see they are tiled perfectly. And if I add another view, you can see they'll start to tile vertically, which is determined by the size. So as you can see, 40 results in 3 being stacked because they are at the center. So I'll just resize it to 180. And now I am able to fit a grand total of 10 in a row, and then it will start wrapping around to the next one. But I do not want to place all these item slots individually, so we can go and make a script for that, which let's just have that be the inventory script. And let's give it a class name as well. And now let's provide it with an array of item slots. And let's just have that be the slots variable. And let's save the scene. And now we want to be able to set up the slots. So let's just create that. And now let's just do the following. To create 40 different slots. And then let's just load. Actually, we can just do slot scene, make it a packed scene, and we can load the item slot. So let's copy the path. And now this will hold the slot scene. So next up, let's instantiate these whenever we get one. So the current slot would be an instantiation of the slot scene. And let's then add it as a child to the flow container. And let's give this a type. And finally, let's add it to the array of slots. So now we have a simple array to keep track of them, and I actually need to do dot append to add it to the array. So now any slot created will just simply get appended to the slot. So instead of an item slot, let's add the entire inventory, and let's anchor it to the center of the screen. And let's, for now, just remove this code until we add a way to do it with the inventory. And now let's get started on actually having the inventory manage items. So let's have a simple thing that will add items. We'll add an item, and it will take in an item stack, and it will just return void, though you can make it return whatever you want. And just so we can know how much we can put in a stack, let's add a new function to the item stack, which will just be get space left. And this will return an integer, simply stating that the item dot max stack size minus stack size, since that is how much we can still fit in to the stack before it is full. So next, I'm expecting to never need to pass in an item stack that is more than the max stack size, though if it is, you may want to modify this. But let's just repeat through every slot. So for per slot in slots, if the item is empty, let's just simply set the item stack equal to the new item. Otherwise, if the item is the same, so if the item they contain is of the same material or basic item, let's check how much space is left. And so we can just do that through curslot.itemStack.getSpaceLeft. And let's put that in a new variable, which will just be the change in how much space we have. And then let's take the minimum of that and the item dot stack size, just so we don't ever go too large and reach a negative value. And once we get the change, we will add it to curslot's item stack and remove it from the item stack's item stack, so that the total change remains constant. And let's just take the stack size of that. And now, once we choose to add an item, it should set the item if the item slot is completely empty, and otherwise it adds however much there is. And then let's just say that if this is true, we just immediately exit out of the loop. And otherwise, if item.stackSize is equal to 0, we break out then, just to break out a bit earlier if it fully works. And no items are left ungiven, so we don't have to repeat through the entire inventory if the first slot can fit all of the item. So just to make sure that works, we can modify the game manager script to, instead of doing nothing when the button is pressed as it currently is, we can go into the inventory and add an item, and we will create a new item stack. which we can load from ID. Again, stone. And this time, let's just make it a nice and even 10. And if this indeed works, which it does not, just give me a bit to see what for it does not. After reviewing my code, it has come to my attention I'm just an idiot. I merely forgot to actually call setting up the slots. So you just have a ready that calls setup slots. And if I've not been an idiot again, which it turns out I have been, and I see why, instead of getting the scene, I got the script. And I've been an idiot yet again, it would see, which is very interesting. Again, due to me having been an idiot. And as you can see now, the slots are actually there. And you can see we now actually add up to 30 stone. And if I simply were to change the max stack size to 25 instead of 30, you can see it keeps track of it perfectly. And that is how you implement the maximum stack size in a fairly simplistic way. Next up, let's provide the item slot with a highlight for when you hover over it. So first of all, let's provide it with a color rect, and let's just have that span across the entire sprite of the item slot. And let's just give it a somewhat nice color. So I will just quickly set that up as this. I believe would look good. Just a nice light highlight. And by default, let's just have that be hidden, and let's call it highlight. Another thing you'll want to do is go into mouse, and then change the filter to ignore so that it doesn't interfere with any other mouse functions. And then let's provide it with an area 2D and a collision shape. And let's just have that be the highlight detection. And then let's provide that with a collision shape, which will be a rectangle, and it will just span the entirety of this. Now, if you go into Node, you will see inside of the area 2D, mouse entered and mouse exited, which can be used to check when the mouse has entered or exited this area. So we can just simply connect those signals to the item slot, and when it has entered, we will simply show the highlight. And if it has just exited, we will instead hide the highlight. And as you can see, when I now go into this, you will see that they do show. And as you can see, when I go here, it will not show the highlight, which is because in the inventory, the flow container has the mouse set to pass rather than ignore. So you can see once I fix that, it works perfectly as you'd want it to. And it highlights whatever you're on. Even if there's an item there, it will highlight the item as well. So that is a nice visual detail, and it makes it feel a lot more polished. Now let's finally get to adding the actual functionality for the inventory, aka it will be able to register clicks. So let's have a simple variable that keeps track of the ID of the current highlighted slot. And whenever a slot changes its highlight, let's have a signal for that. So let's have a signal for when the highlight is changed. And we'll pass an ID. And we will pass a boolean for whether it is highlighted or not. This is so that if we emit the signal from two different nodes, one that is unhighlighted will not go after the one that is highlighted and still override the highlight. So just to catch that edge case. And let's give every slot its own ID. which will be set inside of the inventory loop. So let's set the ID to the current slot. Now, whenever we change the highlight, let's emit the highlight changed signal with the ID and true if we entered it, and false if we exited it. And just to confirm that it works, we can add this called change highlight, which will take in an ID and whether it's highlighted. And then, if the highlighted slot is equal to the ID and the highlight is false, we set the highlighted slot ID to -1 just to represent a null value. So let's have that be its default value as well. Otherwise, we can set the highlighted slot ID to the ID provided. And now whenever we change the highlighted slot ID should update correspondingly. So let's just test that as well. And also let's have this return void. And actually one more thing to do is whenever we create a slot, we'll want to connect its highlight changed signal to the change highlight function. And now as I hover over this first row, you can see we have the numbers 0 printed up until 9, since that is the 10th slot. And if we do that only for when we actually set the highlighted slot ID, we would see that when I do this, we simply get the values that it's changed to quite neatly. So that works quite well, I'd say. And now we can move on to actually having clicks interact with the inventory. So to begin, let's add an input function, which will just be the built-in Godot. And let's register if the left click is pressed. So I'll first add that to the input map. So I'll add a left click and a right click. And I'll just bind those up to the corresponding mouse button. And now that those are added, we can simply check if it's action pressed. The reason I'm not doing just pressed is because I want to be able to drag click as well. Though if you're not planning on drag click functionality, you can do just pressed and have only clicks. That is also fully valid. And let's check if left click is pressed. Now, to avoid it pressing again, let's keep track of what slots it has clicked, which by default will just be an integer array. And let's also keep track of the current click type, which will be a string and will generally be this. And let's have this be an empty array. And then let's set the current click type to left click. And just to make it so that when you release a click, it fully resets this, let's check if input.isAction just released per click type. And if so, we can set the per click type back to an empty string and change the clicked slots to an empty array. And now if it is clicked, we want a cursor item to reflect changes. So for that, we can simply create a new sprite2d. We're basically just recreating these two because that is what the cursor item will look like. So let's also provide it with a label. And let's have this be the cursor item sprite and cursor stack size. Now that that is created, we can change these two accordingly to what the cursor item will be, which I'll just have be an item stack, which is exactly why, rather than having the item stack also handle the visuals, I separated that into item slot and had item stack just handle solely these two values. It is precisely so we could reuse it more easily in other parts of the code. So when we click, if the clicked slots is empty, which you can write either as this, or since an empty array will always be interpreted as false, and if it has any data, it will be interpreted as true, we can simply check if it is false through checking if not clicked slots. If that is so, we can add the highlighted slot ID to the clicked slots, just so we keep track of whether or not it is clicked. And then we can swap the item between the cursor item and the slot item. So what we can do is have a temporary variable, which will be an item stack, be equal to the cursor item dot item stack. Well, since the cursor item is an item stack, we can just set it to that actually. Then we can go to the highlighted slot ID inside of slots and simply set its item stack. Or well, since we are setting this to cursor item, we would want to do the cursor item first. So let's set the cursor item to the slots highlighted slot ID item stack. And we'll set this to the temporary value we declared over here, since cursor item is obviously changed in between these two declarations. Now, whenever this changes, we would like the cursor item sprite to reflect those changes. So let's simply check if the cursor item is not null, and if it is null, we would want to hide these two nodes. And let's also simply, by default, have it hidden. And since this actually inherits this visibility, we can simply only hide the cursor item sprite. Then if it is not null, we would like its position to be set to the mouse position, which I'm doing global mouse position just to have the actual position in space. So if the screen were to be scrolled in any way, this should still be accurate. And let's simply show it. And let's also set the texture to the texture of the cursor item. And let's also set the cursor stack size dot text to the string representation of the stack size. And I'll also define this with the same parameters as I had set in item slot. So that would be right horizontal alignment, center vertical alignment, which again is arbitrary. I have auto wrap mode off, but you can set it to whatever, depending on what you would like. I just have this for later in the tutorial. Well, yeah, for later in the tutorial, or maybe a later tutorial. And we'll simply set the anchor preset to custom and set the grow direction to be to the left, so that, again, if this were to grow, it would grow to the left. And let's provide this with just a general item just so we can check the alignment of this. And let's provide it with the same 8-pixel font size. And let's shrink it to be relative to the item as this one is, for which I believe we can actually simply copy these variables. So that would be 5 and -1 for the size. So, or well, the position, 5 and -1. And for the size, we would simply have it be 5 and 12. And just like that, we should have a cursor item where we, or I suppose not, depending on what this issue is, though I do see what it is. So we would simply need to check if the item stack is not equal to null. And if it's not, we can connect its value, just because otherwise there is no item stack of which to connect the changed value. Now let's retry this. And pressing supposedly does not work. So let's see why it does not. So just allow me a moment to go through the code and see what I did wrong. So my mistake was actually quite simple. I'd just accidentally written else instead of elif highlighted. So it was setting the highlighted slot ID if the ID did not match and it was not highlighted. So, or simply was highlighted as it should have been. So we can change that by just simply changing it to elif highlighted. And as you can see now, it works perfectly. Also, as you can see, I have added a wood button, which gives us our wood material in the exact same way that I added the stone button initially. And as you can see, even with the two stack sizes being different, being 45 and 25 respectively, they each obey their max stack sizes perfectly. And you can see you can swap them out. Though one issue arises when you have two stacks of the same material and try to intuitively add them together, since they'll simply be swapped as we have it currently. So let's add the intuitive thing of, instead of that, having them add up. So first of all, let's clean this code up a bit. So as you can see, I slightly modified this to be backwards. And I will simply add a statement where if the cursor item is null and the highlighted slots item is null, we will just simply return. And you can also see that if the highlighted slot ID is -1, this code will not run, since if this was not part of the code, you could simply have an item and click it here to add it to the last stack in the inventory, which I would prefer to not have. So instead, it would simply do nothing. Though now let's get to adding the adding of items. So first of all, if any of the two items is null, then that will be the only null item, since if they were both null, we wouldn't get to there. So let's just add that in. And let's just make this an or, actually. And we will want to also run this code if the items simply do not match. So let's copy this one just to have it be a bit faster. So this will run if the items in the slots are not the same. Otherwise, which means that the items are the same, we will want to get the change, which will simply be an integer, akin to how we got it here. So I will write it mostly the same, but instead it will be the highlighted slot stack size, well, the space left, and the cursor items stack size. And then we will simply take the stack size of the highlighted slot and add the change. And for the cursor item, we would simply remove the change. Though there is still one issue with this, as you will see shortly. If I simply add the items currently, you can see that you will retain a stack of 0 in your cursor. So to fix that, which is actually why I reversed these, you will simply want to check if the stack size is 0, and if so, you will want to, of course, hide the cursor, but also you will want to set the cursor item to null. And as you can see, if I do the same thing now, the cursor item will simply disappear, or well, should disappear, though something would appear to be going ever so slightly wrong. And also just one note for why when I do this, the item does not get added to the stack. We are going through the slots one by one and checking if they are null or matching. So if it is null, we will immediately add it to that stack and just break out of the loop immediately. Though if you want to add it to pre-existing stacks first, you could simply add a second one, well, a second loop that handles only null stacks. Though allow me just a moment to see why the cursor item is messing up with this code. And my mistake was quick to spot. I simply had this be a comparison instead of an assignment on accident. So as you can see, if I change it now, you will see that it works perfectly. Even if we have several different stacks in the inventory, it will do exactly what we want it to, and it should even respect the maximum stack size, as you can see here. It will simply add to the maximum and keep the leftovers in your cursor. So that is working perfectly. There are a few other features that I will add off screen and show you, so let's cut to that. So I just imported the code from the actual project, hence the comments and the monstrous size it has grown to. And just a quick few notes: for this to properly work, you will want to add the double left click to your input map and have it be listed as left mouse button double click for the actual input. And in item slot, you will want to add these lines that ensure that if the item stack size is null, the item stack itself is set to null as well, which is for the following case, wherein you can double click to group all items. Since if you did not have the double click in the input map, it would simply not allow you to do anything, at least the way I have it set up. And it would leave behind a lot of just 0 stack size materials if you do not have these lines inside of item slot. And now I will try my best to explain the monstrosity that I have just put into this project, and I hope you'll be able to understand, since I didn't really walk you through the process, because as you can see, it is quite a lot. And I would say it is a fairly good exercise to implement it yourself and just kind of see what you find works best for you, since that is mostly how I set this up and got it feeling right for my desires. So first off, you can see that in here I'm checking if the input map even has the click type I'm checking for, just to reduce warnings thrown by having this be the default. Then we check if the highlighted slot ID is actually a slot, and if so, I just set the slot variable to the corresponding slot just to make it a bit easier to access for me. And then we check for double left click, as you can see by checking if we press left click and it's a double click, which we are allowed to do due to checking if it's an input event mouse button. And if so, we just add up all the items of that type up until a certain maximum stack size, as is denoted by space, which just loops over all of the items in the inventory one by one and adds whatever it can to the cursor item. And if there's no space left in the cursor item, it breaks. Then, if the left click is pressed, if it is a drag click, we just average together however many we are should fit in every slot. So as you can see, 5, then 3 and 1 remainder, then 2 and 2 remainder, and so forth, which the only reason we can change how much is in pre-clicked slots is because of clicked slots and clicked slots change, which clicked slots change stores how much each individual slot is changed, which is specifically important because of the following case, where you cannot drop off all of your items in one slot for however much the average is. As you can see, it hasn't changed that entire time until now, which is just handled by checking if the change in that slot is more than the average. And if it is, we reduce how much has been added to that slot. Otherwise, we just keep it the same and remove however much was in the slot from the cursor item, since we set the cursor item to the total. Or well, we add how much has been taken away back to the cursor item. And if it's should be 0, since it rounds down, we set it to 1, just so that if you go overboard and add it to too many, it doesn't just go back to your cursor. Then we check for if it needs to swap, if the items don't match, as we did before. And lastly, we do another double-click check, which just allows you to tally up the items, whether you're just clicking it in or you already have it in your cursor. Then we do the right clicks, which first off, we just check if there is no cursor item. So if there's no cursor item, we just take half of what is in the stack, and the cursor item gets the higher half. Otherwise, if the cursor item does have an item, and this is not yet a slot we clicked on, and we can drag, we add 1 from the stack to, or well, from the cursor to the stack. Otherwise, if we cannot drag, we check if it's the same, and then we, well, if the item stack is not null, actually, because can drag, we add 1 item to the slot stack if they are the same item. And if they're not the same item, and we just press right click, we swap the two as we did for left click over here. And then we get to this, which allows for the left and right click dragging. So as you can see, if I were to go in here, you can see that here we have no cursor item, but then we get a cursor item, which is just done by, instead of setting it to null, we only hide it if the cursor item stack size is 0, and we are currently holding left or right click. So that is how we do, or well, I do the inventory clicking. Next up, let's make it so that if you're drag clicking, the slots that you've already drag clicked over, such as this, will stay highlighted, so you know that you've already interacted with those, since otherwise it might be confusing, since which of these have you already clicked and which have you not. So to do that, we will go to item slot, and we will just lock this if it needs to be locked. So what we can do is have a highlighted, which will just be a boolean and default to false, or and we can have a highlight locked boolean, which will also default to false. Then we can check if the highlight is locked. Well, if it's not locked, we can just change the highlights, and we won't do this inside of here since we'll want it to be that way regardless, just because that is how we keep track of which slot the cursor is currently on. And we will always change the state of highlighted, since highlighted is how we keep track of if it should be highlighted or not at the end. And let's just do the same here and change it to false. Now, as I mentioned before, we will use highlight locked and highlighted to keep track of when it should be highlighted and when not. So let's have a getter and a setter. And once we have that, we can now modify this to update the highlight. So let's check if highlight locked is false. Then if not highlighted, highlight.hide. Otherwise, we show the highlight. So now when we set highlight locked to false, it should update the highlight corresponding to the highlighted value, which is why we change it in here. And it won't change the highlight if the highlight is locked. So if it's not locked, it will update it, otherwise it won't. And now we must change the code in here. So first of all, when we let go of the click, let's go through all of the clicked slots just so that we can change their highlighted state to no longer be locked. And since that is an int, we will need to go through slots instead. Or well, we need to access it. My apologies. And now we can lock the highlight whenever we drag over something. So we can go to here, which is the first thing that locks it. And we can just do clicked slots dot highlight locked equals true. Or well, not clicked slots, I meant slots highlighted slot ID. And we can copy this to the right click drag, which is right here. And now it should, or it can just not. Let's see why it does not. And it would seem to be here. And it is because I did highlight it locked. Did I make the same mistake lower down? I did not. So that should now be properly working. And as you can see, when I drag over things, it will keep the highlight until you let go of click, and it will properly highlight the slots. So that just makes it look a bit cleaner and makes it nicer to interact with for the user. Lastly, I will go over some differences that the full version, which I will put a link to in the description, has, which are each item can have a rarity, a description, and a name. As you can see in here, the stone is common with a description and just a name. Same for the wood, which is uncommon, and they are all sprite frames instead, in case you want animated textures. You can, of course, again, change it to sprite 2D. As you can see, it's to allow for animated sprites. Getting a color from rarity, which every color, well, rarity has its own color associated, which is what determines the color of the outline in the shader. And each has a string associated with it, which is used for in the description. As you can see, stone common, wood uncommon. So let's go to the description next. Now the description is all the way at the bottom. You can see I have 3 handler functions. One shows the description, which updates it, sets the global position and shows it, and hiding it. And the current description ID just keeps track of which slot is currently being shown, so I don't have to do all of this all the time, only when it's a different slot. So as you can see, I will change the description ID. I will set the size to the maximum description size as defined up here, which is currently 100 pixels. And that's just to keep it from being overly long. As you can see in the stone, it wraps to the next line, which to have it be able to shrink appropriately, I actually have the description set to arbitrary word auto-wrap mode, though it could also, of course, be set to off, since I do not use the built-in auto-wrap. So as you can see, still does what it should, or I guess not. So it will have to be arbitrary. Will have to be arbitrary, otherwise it won't wrap to the next line. That is my fault. But you can see that I use a rich text label, so I can simply push the colors and the description text I want. And that is how I get these differing colors within the text, where you can see this is all the same just because the description is the same color as the common color. But as you can see, for uncommon, it's a different color. And you can see I get the font, the last index, which is the starting index of the substring, and the length of the current substring, which is basically just every line, the highest length in pixels recorded, and the last space we found. So, whilst there's text left to be looped through, we check if there's a new line, and if so, we just set it to be a new line. Otherwise, if it's a space, we record it as the last space index. We check what the size would be, removing the space, and that will be the highest length. And if it's too long, this actually doesn't do anything. So you can actually remove that. That is my fault. I forgot I add that. And you can see it should still be the exact same. And we just create a new line, which just makes the highest length never be longer than the max description size. We also run a final check at the last line, just in case the last line is the longest. And then we set the X length, and the Y size will be just automatically inferred from the rich text label, as you're able to see here. Lastly will be the shader I mentioned before, which is for the item sprite. As you can see here, it's on the material, and you can see that whenever the item stack is changed to a non-null item, we set the color parameter as is defined in here as a vector4, which the shader is merely a fragment shader that changes every pixel that is purely white to the desired color, which they are defined inside of here. So you can see these are the colors associated with the rarity again. And we just set that to, of course, the rarity obtained from the item, which you can see in action here. If I were to change this to be epic, you can see that the stone changes to epic accordingly. So that is a fairly simple way to just have the item change. You can also see that the color of the description changes and the text of the rarity. So that is how you can easily change that. And you can also fully remove it if you don't want outlines on your item like this, or make it your own. The colors are merely placeholders, so you can change these to whatever you want. But that should be all for this tutorial. So I hope this helped you. The download link, the link to the itch page will be in the description. And I'll also have my Discord server where if you have a question, you can ask it there or in the comments. And hopefully, if enough people join, there will be a community to help you as well. So if you're interested in that, you can join the Discord server. And yeah, just if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments or put them in the Discord server. Same if you have any suggestions for tutorials I should do. Though for now, that will be all, and I will see you again in another video.